Hi, I'm Garm1, and this is Midgardia RPG's cool crowdfunding show. I'm here today with Andreas from the Hyperlight Drifter RPG project. How's it going?
Good, good. Hey, everyone.
So, why don't you tell me a little bit about Hyperlight Drifter, the tabletop RPG?
Yeah, so Hyperlight Drifter tabletop RPG. We as Metal Weave Games got the license from Heart Machine, a popular video game IP, the Hyperlight Drifter, and we're right now kickstarting our tabletop interpretation of the Hyperlight Drifter game and creating a new continent in the Hyperlight Drifter universe. So we're right now looking to fund a game book and a setting book to build that all out, all in pixel art.
Cool. And the art is absolutely beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
So, I've never actually played Hyperlight Drifter. I think I was in one of those periods where I wasn't really playing video games. So, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's if you wanted to compare it to something, I would say Bloodborne meets like old school Zelda mechanics. So you have a lot of so old school Zelda, like the top down isometric, where you have your sprites, you're running around a world, figuring out what's going on, what's happening. In this game, there's no dialogue per se, so no one's telling you what to do, and you're more led through like visions, um, and led along this mysterious kind of understanding of what's going on and what your role in this world is. And you're known as a drifter, which is one who goes outside of the town to uncover lost technology and secrets. And so you kind of go out into this broken world universe as you start the game with this very intense vision of like giant creation and destruction almost. And the world is ruined as far as you know. And you go into these deep dungeons, so to speak, vast facilities of ancient technology or from the civilization past, and you're fighting the horrors that lie within, trying to seek answers to yourself almost.
Cool. That sounds really awesome. And,
It's worth picking up. It's on mobile, it's on Switch, it's on PC, it's on PlayStation, Xbox. You can find it everywhere.
yeah, I was looking it up just before this interview, and I immediately added it to my wish list.
Yep, it's totally worth it. It was for free on the Epic Game Store a little while ago.
Yeah, but Epic Game Store has its own. Yeah,
Nah,
um,
free game.
yeah, it, it, it's got its own issues that are possibly beyond the scope of the interview.
Yes.
um,
Business management. It's a different discussion.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so I see you've got a interesting combat system here with a funky little combat map. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the combat system I was pulling for, well, so I guess I started when I was designing it. I wanted to do something, that was sort of tactical, but not like let's lay down a fourth edition grid and duke this all out. So I sort of was looking at inspirations from like Ryutama and like old school Final Fantasy games and stuff like that, looking at like how simplistic combat systems work in the sense that um, your actions still have meaning in terms of positioning and stuff. So Ryutama is interesting because it has literally a front line and a back line on both sides. So you have your allies and your enemies, and you have a front line and then you have a back line. For Drifter, what we ended up doing is I actually like a lot of what fourth edition did, but fourth edition was a little too crunchy. It was a great video game experience in that simulation. And so I wanted to kind of marry the two where you had movement and you had tactical options, but they weren't super tactical in the sense that you would get like analysis paralysis and figuring out what to do, where to go, what was the best optimized action for each thing. So I ended up cutting it down to 9 tiles, which is what we have of the combat grid, which is a diamond broken up into 9 diamonds, with the center kind of being the focal point of most combat. The idea with it is that, kind of like in the old school games, players would start on one side and the enemies would start on the other, and players can move anywhere, and each tile represented like 30 feet or like a short distance. And so you could put mash any number of creatures and enemies into one tile, and that would represent combat. So for most weapon attacks, like melee weapons, you would have a range of 0, which would be the tile that you're in or you're occupying. And so you could attack any enemy that's within that. But if you had an ability like Cleave, you could attack all the enemies that are in your tile. So it makes it simpler in the sense that you don't have to do as much like tile counting. But then you have ranged attacks, which would have like a range of +1. So you could attack one tile away from where you were. So that was at least our effort, and I think it works pretty well. At least so far, it has, because you're able to use it theater of the mind or like in a virtual tabletop space, because you could just say, "Oh, he's too far away," or "He's a short distance away." You can still use those incremental distance modifiers to tell where your enemies are and how different groups how interspace they are between each other. So that's where we sort of kind of landed on the 9x9. I was thinking of 4x4, but that's like too small. There's no real purpose in what would be the benefit of moving a tile if everything's within range. So 9x9 was kind of the happy medium of that. And of course, you can always make more tiles if you want, but that's not like the intention. At least starting off, because how I GM is I'm a very hacky person. I'm going to take a system and try to expand how much potential it has. And so I want to provide those tools and resources for other GMs and narrators to kind of make it their own.
Awesome. And that is a good solution to that fairly classic problem. I can already see places where I'd apply that same kind of combat grid. Do you mean 3x3, by the way? Or do you mean 3x3 grid? You were saying 9x9.
3x3?
Yeah, you were saying 9x9. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, nine squares total, 3x3. Yeah.
All right, just making sure. Yeah. So I was looking at this and I'm like, I don't see 9x9 here.
1, 2, 3. Wait.
that would get into like 4E grid territory, certainly.
Oh yeah. Gosh. I mean, like even just adding one set of tiles on each side to like a 4x4, you would start. If you wanted to put like set pieces in or something like that, like put a big giant tower in the middle or something, you could totally do that. And that would, obviously change the dynamic in relationships. So like players would pay energy to move a tile, but they could also use their dashes to move like tiles for free or evade damage. And so they have options of moving around the grid.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing, like you said, you could definitely tweak for bigger, more important fights around a set piece, which is always something really cool to have in a system like this. Making, because with a grid like this, you run into the problem of like every combat can get kind of samey, but that kind of solves that really elegantly. Good job.
Totally. Thank you. I hope it works out that way. I mean, so far feedback's been pretty good on it. Tweaking combat system is usually the biggest focus of the playtest, and being a resource management game, that's a huge part. So one of the early playtests that happened that I didn't run, which is always terrifying when you hand your game off to someone else and be like, "Here, run it. Hope it goes well." Is how they GM a game, because obviously it's their interpretation of your rules, and so they missed one rule about reducing costs, and it was the team was like, "It's brutal," and they practically almost died by the skin of their teeth. And so one of the that clarification of the rules, like, "Oh, my bad." But
yeah,
just little numbers like that, like, oh, moving a tile or getting up costs, so in our system we have things cost energy and your ability scores reduce that cost. In this, he made it the ability to get up and move tiles costed energy no matter what your ability scores were. So it was a constant drain on that resource, and it destroyed the entire party practically. By the end of the match, I think like 2 were unconscious, and it was bad.
That does sound rough. Certainly not ideal. And that's the point of playtesting, right? To find those little things that people are likely to miss or another DM might interpret differently.
Oh yeah.
Lord knows we've seen enough of that in our time of playtesting various people's stuff.
Oh yeah.
So you've got a lot of interesting stuff going on in this game. Could you give me some highlights? Like, what are your favorite mechanics in this?
So I guess the energy management's obviously a big piece of it. I wanted to do something. So I started in 3rd edition D&D, playing 3rd edition to 3.5, and then 4th edition kind of, my group and where I was, college and the group splitting kind of reduced how much we played. And then Numenera, so I kind of had a dry spell from then. And then Numenera Kickstarter came along, and that's when I kind of became a creator, so to speak, like fan license, and then started publishing with Kickstarter and stuff like that. So Numenera was sort of like a backbone of my creative works. And so there was a lot. There was actually an original intention to license with the Cypher system, but details just never worked out. So we pivoted into making our own system because, well, part of the issue that we were going to have with Cypher is that we had a bunch of changes we wanted to make, and there were a lot of changes. Kind of what's almost seen here is like we wanted to change how ability scores worked. We wanted to change how energy works. So essentially, like we wanted to collapse all the pools into one. And I'm sure they wouldn't have been happy with all the things that we were changing and still calling it Cypher. So fortunately, that just like, okay, if we're doing our own thing, let's make it our own thing. And that's where the combat board innovations came from. This is where the threshold system innovations came from. And energy was one of the carryover system that we kind of like, that's what we wanted to do for sure, is we wanted to consolidate how energy management worked and how characters interfaced with their abilities through that energy management. That was sort of like the background of where we started. And then from there, we were researching systems as, it being an indie, in video games and tabletop games, reading, Dungeon World, reading Savage Worlds, reading all the other systems that exist. There are so many now. Shadow of the Demon Lord, Tridvang, Ryutama, and so just reading up on those systems and kind of, so for me, I liked the idea of PTBAs or Powered by the Apocalypse is, partial success, but then I wanted to use the D20 because I'm not a big fan of 2D6. Part of the reason is to do something different, and then also the D20 being like a symbol of the industry. So if I'm expecting that a lot of new people who haven't played tabletop RPGs are going to get into this industry through this game, through this IP. And so part of it is, if the D20 is the core of that, let's start with that and make that the only dice in the game. And that decision, kind of like in Hyperlight Drifter, where they said, okay, we're not going to do text dialogue, what are the ramifications of this decision? And so for in Hyperlight Drifter, how they try to convey things was through like a slideshow almost of visuals that they presented to the player, like 3 or 4, depending on the NPC you talked to. And so for us, like deciding that we're using solo the D20 in an energy management system is how do I build other features around that system to support, open-ended narrative gameplay without focusing too heavily on combat, despite, combat is a huge part of the system, but allowing social exploration. And exploration was the second part we wanted to focus on, because that was kind of one of our quips with Numenera going into this too, is how do we make social and exploration more focused? And so we created like a list of skills, and this is where we came into our disciplines, our social, combat, exploration, and survival. I believe that's what they are. Survival, I believe, is what the fourth one is. And so survival and exploration, we categorized skills between those. And so we used like a 4th edition style skill challenge and other methodologies to create ways where players could still spend energy and have that immersive, like fast-paced action without spending too much time on what's my bonus to the roll and stuff like that. So try to keep it rules light while still keeping the core of everything and having everything work together properly.
Cool. And yes, survival is the last one. You got it.
Yeah, okay. when you change names, you're like, what version was that? Shoot.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understand. We still call for like spot checks every once in a while in 5th edition. We're like, that's not a thing.
It's perception, right?
Yeah, it's perception.
Passive perception. Wait, that's still around?
It is.
I know.
I don't know what to think of passive perception. One of the many things you can see is
It has
contentious.
its uses.
It
It's just when
does.
to use it.
Yeah, it's just a problem when like somebody has a 24 passive perception. Enjoy never seeing it. Like enjoy never getting hit by a trap.
Hmm.
Um. Anyway, yeah. No, this is I, I'm I'm gonna have to pick up Hyper Light Drifter like maybe
Oh,
tonight.
it's an awesome game. It is visually gorgeous. It is difficult, or sorry, its boss fights are difficult. There are two random difficult fights in the game, and other than that, it's beautiful. Like you'll bash your head against a couple bosses for a little while, but it's the mastery of the system. Kind of like the Dark Souls. Like you'll know you've mastered combat once you've spent a half hour on a boss. And
Yeah. So what was the most difficult thing to adapt from Hyper Light Drifter to Drifter the tabletop game?
so I think the most difficult thing, which I'm still approaching, is setting development. So obviously we're building a new continent in the Drifter universe. This is part of our like charter in the sense that we're not really touching the events of the game to um, leave that gold nugget as it is. And so now we're looking to create a new continent with a similar story, there'll be a bunch of parallels to it, but we're creating new regions, new enemies, new lore, and something that like we learned from our Embers project in terms of creating so Embers is one of our prior projects which created a systemless region emulating lessons from Dark Souls in the Soulsborne universe. So I spent a ton of time poring over Vati Vidya videos. Um, he's a big lore monger of the Dark Souls community, and just going through storytelling techniques and how they put together a narrative for Dark Souls, and then how to apply that to a tabletop game where it would make sense. So Dark Souls, you die, you come back, you die, you come back. It's kind of hard to tell a tabletop game where you die and come back, because then what's the point of dying? The medium doesn't allow that in the sense. And so part of that was creating the story structure that the Soulsborne games rely on, or like the figuring out that structure and then creating a narrative from that. And so we're looking to do something similar in terms of diving into Drifter, is creating that overarching narrative that's not explicitly stated, but like, characters have goals, they have motivations, and you sort of, as you read through them, you can kind of see what's going on, but the players aren't going to see that. So when players start interfacing with characters, the narrator will know like what their motivations, what their goals are, and perhaps what their relationships are with a couple other key NPCs. But the players will discover that as they interact with each character. And so through that, the narrator can then, or the GM can then create a world that feels more interconnected and more nebulous than they're leading on to, in addition to creating world hooks, setting hooks, and so forth. So there's gonna be a lot of setting work that's gonna be going into this. And the other challenging part too is that we're getting Hyperlight's approval through all of this too. So as a licensed IP, got to get approvals on everything. So same with art. So like that's why when we're developing art, we have to be a little more withholding because we got to go through the approvals first. So
Yeah, absolutely. Licensed games don't have the best reputation historically, save for a few things like West End games, Star Wars, and
hmm
West End games, Ghostbusters, and that's about it. Um, actually, yeah, that's pretty much it. No, maybe the fucking Smallville tabletop game. That's good.
I've been dying for a Morrowind RPG.
I mean, that's just D&D, man.
I know, right?
You already have Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or 13th Age or
Every other system in existence.
there is no shortage of fantasy tabletop games. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So, but yeah, that would probably be the biggest challenge is one, building that setting, and then two, making sure the art style is all consistent between it, because pixel art is a different challenge, for making something look good. Because we're working with, was it 255 by 4 or 297 by 455 pixels, and then we scale that up to a spread. So like the Hyperlight Drifter game is illustrated in 270 pixels. And so we're doing the same aspect ratio, just scaled screen wise to what a book spread would be. And then from there, we have to like scale it up by 3000% so that it doesn't print with weird distortions.
That's that's brutal. Yeah. I I used to do some sprite art way back in the day. Please don't Google it. Um,
Now I want to look.
you won't find it. It's long gone. It was just like crappy recolors of Mega Man sprites for the most part. You know, like smacking stuff together until it looks cool.
Oh yeah.
Uh, the old days. But yeah, I'm interested to see what you guys do for the setting. I've read some of your other stuff. I believe you guys were the Baby Bestiary
Yep.
guys.
Baby
Yeah,
Mystery. That was our flagship starter slash runaway project.
yeah, that's what really put you on the map. I gave my players a Cerberus from it once. Worst mistake I've ever made. Um,
Best mistake you've ever. What happened?
um, Mostly they had a very powerful dog, and then the campaign kind of crumpled in on its own weight. DMing's
uh,
hard. Uh,
yeah, it is. There's a lot of. That's why. That's why I improvise.
yeah,
And even then, it's hard. I
yeah.
totally agree.
So what do you guys have in the works for like virtual tabletop support? Because I see that's an option on here, and as somebody who uses Roll20 all the time, it seems like I could just slap the combat grid on there and call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do that, totally. So what I would like to create is some overlays that people would be able to use, potentially animated ones. That'd be awesome if we could get a couple bit of. Um, we're working with. We'll be working with the character generator app. That's one of our stretch goals, but we've already kind of sort of started concept work on that to do a character generator. So then from there, you'd be able to like generate pixel art characters and export them. So
Nice.
you could put that in the game or in your virtual tabletop. One of the things I want to do is have sprites. So we have some assets from the game, but those are at a certain aspect ratio, and so we have to upres them a little bit. So like for instance, Roll20 is 70 by 70 or something like that.
Yep.
The assets we would get out of like Hyperlight Drifter would probably be like 25. So if I'm like exporting a little enemy carry sprite, so it's actually too small. And if I scale it up, its resolution would be this. It would just be next neighbor interpolation. So it's not as detailed as if we added our characters in. So one of the things is creating upresing essentially. So we'd have to do a bunch of artwork on that side, or either redoing the asset itself, using it as a base and like adding a little more detail because we're increasing the bit quality of that. So one is creating enemies, characters that people can use, and the other is set pieces. So imagine seeing, you have the combat grid over grass, you have the combat grid underground. So I have a couple ideas on how to make it look more like a battleground almost. I would say, have you ever played Heroes of Might and Magic?
I
Like
played Heroes
three?
of Might and Magic 4, I think.
Oh, okay, that's close enough.
Yeah.
So you get in combat and you have like the battle map, and so we're thinking of, or even like League of Legends, I would say, because like how the entire map is sitting on an open space at an angle. So we
Right.
want to do something like that where you can see sort of like something along the border rim, something along the back wall, um, and then creating some like detail sprites for putting in as environmental and stuff like that. So it would be a combat grid overlay on top of something else, or that would be the whole thing. So looking at providing a few more like visual resources in that regard.
That'd be super cool. Make it a little bit more immersive.
Exactly.
So you've got a lot of interesting stuff here. Any other particular things you wanna highlight?
Um,
I see you've got a soundtrack.
yes. So we reached out to Disaster Piece, who's a known composer, and he's the one that did all the entire soundtrack for Hyperlight Drifter, which is really cool. You should listen to it. It's only like $5 on SoundCloud, or no, sorry, Basecamp, Bandcamp, Bandcamp.
Bandcamp, yeah.
That was it. It's like $5 on Bandcamp, um, and it's a really good soundtrack. And so we found that there are a number of So he owns the music that Hyper Light Drifter used essentially as part of their partnership. And so we reached out to him, and there's a couple unused tracks and tracks that he created for the game that, throughout the 3 years of development that weren't used, or that he created a number of like ditties, short tunes. And so we're looking at having him clean those up, and then we'll repurpose them for our setting. And so we'll have little hooks in terms of what characters those belong to or calls. I haven't heard them all yet, so I'm going to have to build them in as I get them. But it'll be awesome to. I've only heard a couple of the tracks so far, but it'll be a nice little addition, especially for those who are Hyper Light Drifter fans and especially fans of Disaster Piece, to get a bit more Hyper Light music out.
Awesome. That's really interesting, actually, getting your hands on some like unreleased stuff for it.
Oh yeah, and he's gonna clean up some of it too, because he's like, yeah, I got a couple like piano pieces, guitar ditties, and stuff like that, but it's definitely not ready for release. But like, he can make them ready for, or at least make them like listenable.
Yeah, audio editing is hard, man.
I can't imagine. There's actually a really cool GDC talk on one of the audio engineers or the sound effects engineers for Hyperlight, and how like he created 37 sounds mashed in to make the one sword swipe noise. He's like, if you want a tiger, put it in there.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. There's Foley art is a whole different thing. Like, the amount of stuff that Foley artists do, it's amazing. I've heard stories from like BioWare and the stuff that they did for the Reaper sounds, and how it's just like various noises they made against their dumpster and then mashed together and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's nuts.
Crazy stuff.
Also, I really adore the box that the like starter box you have. It's styled in the style of the old Super Nintendo box. Yeah,
and that's something that's we're really excited about too. Is because I really wanted to create a box that I could sell or like try to put in stores for the most part, and that's what we're making it as the starter box. So I was torn forever, like whether it was going to be like a deluxe box or a starter box. I only want to make one box because it's going to be expensive, to do it no matter what I pick. So the idea is that like we're going to make a starter box. It's going to have the basic rules in it. It's going to have, your combat board. It's going to have a bunch of all your tokens, your dice, everything you need to get started in playing. And one of the things, that indie games are known for is like that SNES demake. So Hyperlight Drifter, yeah. So Hyperlight Drifter, for as part of their Kickstarter, they had a SNES demake box.
Nice.
With their own little cartridge. I had to get a hold of this post project, but
it's that horrible blue
there's
color.
No chip in it. It would be cool if it was, but
it's that horrible blue color that third-party stuff used. Nice. That's detail.
So I want to continue that vein in terms of making Hyperlight Drifter, since it's kind of like the first pixel tabletop RPG, to follow in that vein of the SNES demake. So like our game box will be like, the SNES box. So we're doing like, similar styling, branding in the sense of what you would expect in that visual style. And then hopefully later on, I would love to do a bunch of adventure boxes with, you might have a little, the sheet for perhaps like a custom combat board, perhaps a bunch of punch out enemies that you can like put down on the table, and then like the game book or the adventure book, and maybe like a token or a mini or something like that. So that's what I would love to do next, is then do like a bunch of game boxes with each of the adventures in them.
Little expansion boxes, yeah.
Oh yeah. Maybe, I think that'd be really fun to make.
Maybe done up like a Game Boy cartridge or something.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to see I don't even know what it takes to produce the SNES demakes, but I'll have to look into that.
I could not tell you.
That's all right.
Oh, well, I'm way more excited for this game than I was before the start of this interview, and I was still pretty excited then.
Well, I'm glad. It's definitely worth checking out, and we're in playtest now, so you can go download. I'm actually, before this call, I was working on the update to the playtest rules, so we got a bunch of feedback that I need to implement, changes that from feedback that we're going to be putting in and giving people a new look at what. Now I have to create a patch log and stuff like that. Like video games, like here are the things we've changed from version 0.7 to 0.8.
Yeah,
So,
that's always fun. You got to include witty comments in there. It's what made Minecraft famous. Have have removed Herobrine on every single line because it's still funny the 20th time.
oh yeah.
Vintage jokes that only like 20 people watching this video are gonna care about. Anyway, yeah.
It's the 20 people that make it possible, though.
Yep. I mean, that's more views than some of our videos get. So, anyway,
Right.
now I'm done like dating and deprecating myself. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about while you're here?
I don't think. Came here to talk about Hyperlight Drifter, so I mean, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on and chat.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me. And yeah, this campaign's got 10 days to go, so it's done on October the 12th.
Yep, and we're practically funded.
Yeah,
I think we're like 93, 94%, so.
Yeah, I can't do math in my head right now,
That's
but
just about there.
yeah, it gives me the numbers in Canadian, so it's always a little harder to do the math.
Oh,
It's like
gosh.
61,278 out of $66,082. I'm like, I can't do that off the top of my head.
That's
Looks like you're 92%. That's what it is. All right.
things go up and down.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's about it.
Cool.
Once again, thank you very much for coming out to talk about this, and for everybody watching, have a good night.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.